She was 8 years old, standing on a kitchen chair to reach the stove, making dinner for her younger siblings because their mother worked nights and someone had to eat before bedtime. Nobody taught her to do this in any formal way. She just noticed one evening that if she didn't do it, it wouldn't get done, and something in her quietly decided that from now on, it would. Ask her today, decades later, what her childhood was like, and she'll likely tell you it was fine. Normal even. She won't necessarily describe it as difficult, because to her, it never felt like a choice between childhood and responsibility. It simply felt like what needed to happen. That's exactly what makes this pattern so easy to miss, both from the outside and from within the person carrying it. Children who grow up too fast rarely announce it. There's no dramatic scene, no single defining moment most people would recognize as a loss. Instead, there's a quiet, gradual transfer of weight, responsibilities shifting onto small shoulders long before those shoulders were built to hold them, and by the time anyone notices, it's already been normalized into simply who that person is. Today, I want to walk through what actually happens, psychologically, to a child who takes on adult-level responsibility too early, the specific mechanism behind why this shapes personality so permanently, and the one trait that shows up in nearly every adult who experienced this, one they usually don't even recognize as connected to their childhood at all. The first thing almost nobody understands about this pattern is that it's rarely caused by one dramatic event. It's caused by role reversal, a child stepping into a function that should have belonged to an adult, whether that's emotional caretaking, physical caregiving, or simply becoming the responsible one in a household where nobody else was reliably filling that role. This might look like managing younger siblings while a parent works multiple jobs. It might look like becoming a parent's emotional confidant during a divorce, absorbing adult stress that was never meant to be shared with a child. It might look like translating for parents in a new country, handling paperwork, phone calls, appointments no child should have to navigate alone. In every version, the underlying mechanism is the same. The child adapts to fill a gap, and that adaptation, repeated daily, becomes the architecture of who they grow into. Here's where it gets interesting. Developmental psychologists describe this as parentification, and one of its most important features is that it doesn't feel like trauma while it's happening. It feels like competence. It feels like being needed, trusted, capable, often earning genuine praise from adults around them. So mature for her age. Such a responsible kid. That praise reinforces the exact pattern that's quietly overriding a normal childhood. This is precisely why the effects are so hard to spot later. There's no single wound to point to, no isolated bad memory that explains everything. Instead, there's a slow, steady erosion of the parts of childhood that were supposed to be unstructured, protected, allowed to fail without consequence, replaced instead by a constant, low-level awareness that things depended on them. Here's a pattern that explains something confusing about adults who experienced this. An almost automatic instinct to manage other people's emotions before their own even register. A child who grows up monitoring a parent's mood, gauging whether it's safe to ask for something, learning to read a room before speaking, is essentially building an early warning emotional radar system, one that runs constantly, often below conscious awareness. This system doesn't switch off once the child becomes an adult and leaves that environment. It keeps running, now aimed at partners, friends, coworkers, anyone whose emotional state might need managing. Many adults who grew up this way describe an exhausting, near-instant awareness of everyone else's needs in a room, alongside a genuine difficulty identifying what they themselves need in that same moment, because that question was rarely, if ever, asked of them as a child. Here's where the cost becomes clearer, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Children who grow up too fast often develop extraordinary competence alongside a deep, largely unconscious discomfort with being cared for. Because their early role was to provide rather than receive, being on the receiving end of care later in life, having someone genuinely look after them, check on them, take something off their plate, can feel strange, even uncomfortable, in a way that's difficult to explain to people who didn't grow up the same way. This isn't because they don't want care. It's because the entire architecture of their early life trained them to be the one holding things together, and being held, instead of holding, doesn't have a natural place to fit inside that architecture yet. This is part of why so many people who grew up this way struggle to ask for help even when they desperately need it. Not out of pride exactly, but because asking runs directly against a role they've been playing successfully and rewarded for since before they can even clearly remember. Before we get to the central mistake underneath all of this, one thing is worth being clear about. This pattern isn't limited to households in crisis or obvious dysfunction. It shows up in smaller, quieter versions too. The oldest child who naturally became the responsible one, the kid who learned early to keep the peace between arguing parents, the one who always seemed a little more grown up than their age at every family gathering. If any part of this sounds familiar, even in a mild form, you're likely recognizing a smaller version of the exact same mechanism, not something that only applies to extreme cases. The trait that shows up more consistently than almost any other, once you actually talk to adults who grew up this way, is a deep discomfort with simply doing nothing, resting without guilt, existing without being useful to someone in that exact moment. A childhood built around being needed creates an adult who often can't quite locate the off switch, who feels a quiet unease during unstructured time that most people would experience as relaxing, because unstructured time was never really safe or available to them in the first place. The biggest mistake almost everyone makes when looking at this pattern, including the people who lived it, is mistaking competence for evidence that everything was actually fine. "I turned out okay" gets used as proof that the early responsibility didn't really cost anything, when in reality, turning out competent and carrying an invisible weight into every future relationship are not mutually exclusive outcomes. Both can be true at the same time. The people who eventually work through this do something specific. They start distinguishing between the skills that role built, real, valuable skills like resourcefulness, emotional attunement, reliability, and the belief underneath those skills that their worth depends on being useful. The skills can stay. The belief is the part that actually needs to be examined and slowly, deliberately, unlearned. So no, the girl standing on that kitchen chair wasn't simply mature for her age. She was quietly absorbing a role nobody should have needed her to fill, one that would go on to shape nearly every relationship, every boundary, every moment of rest she'd have for decades afterward, long after anyone remembered there was ever a chair involved at all. That's really the whole difference, not maturity. A childhood spent holding weight that was never supposed to be hers to carry. If this describes someone you love, or maybe described you, stick around, because next time, I'll walk through exactly how adults who grew up this way can start learning to receive care without the guilt that used to come attached to it.